All right. Well, thank you everybody for being here today for the Clements Library Bookworm. Um, we're in our 7th episode, believe it or not. I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library, and your host today. Please note that today's meeting is being recorded online so that we can share it afterwards. This afternoon, you'll receive an email with the recording and the resources mentioned during today's broadcast. Many of you have already found the chat function. Thank you so much for participating in this way. Please continue to chime in. You can select all panelists and attendees so that we can all see your comments. That would be great. The conversation goes by read your toolbar that there's also a Q&A section. That's a great place for you to type in your questions. Then you can also upvote other people's questions. If you have comments about questions, you can type them in right there. I think it says something like answer this question, but it's okay to type in comments if you have a question that relates to that question. And if we type in the answers, they're posted along with it, or we can answer them live later in the broadcast. My colleagues Ann Bennington-Helber and Tracy Pavlovich will be helping to monitor the chat, answer questions, and post links. So thanks, Ann and Tracy. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library encourages the discovery, teaching, and learning of American history through the collection, conservation, and availability of primary sources on paper. If you're interested in more information about the Clements Library, check us out online at clements.umich.edu. I'm so happy to welcome today's panelists who are going to be talking about biographies. They've each read a really interesting biography with some historical characters who are, interesting people. So it'll be fun to hear a lot more about them. But before we start those presentations, I'll stop for a minute just to take a look at the poll results. We were talking about how we obtain our books. Many of the panelists agree that we use all of these methods and more. So I'm curious to see what everybody else says. Let me just get back to the poll and end polling, share results. The purchase new and checkout from the library is tied as the top ways to get books, but clearly all of the others have some impact as well. Before I go on, I see that Doug is wondering about the significance of the cup of tea on the first slide. And so I will mention that the idea for the Clements Bookworm came from our traditional Clements Library tea time at 10 o'clock every day. Our researchers are invited to join with each other and the Clements curators and staff to discuss their work at tea time. And the conversations that come out of that experience are so wonderful, and people learn a lot from each other. They find out more sources for their research, and of course, especially people who are at the Clements for a long time, we start to share things like book recommendations. I know Andrew and Emi for sure have participated in tea time. Do either of you have any comments about Clements tea time?
They're amazing. They're almost better than actually doing research in the wonderful collections that Clements has, just because of the conversation and the people. And lovely. The snacks. Well, people bring in delicious snacks all the time.
That is very true. So, well, thank you. So I'm going to go back to the screen and continue on. Our first speaker today is Peggy Harrington. I'm so happy to welcome Peggy to the Bookworm. She's a longtime Clements Library Associate, an alumna of the University of Michigan, an avid reader, and a retired doctor of anesthesiology. So Peggy, what book are you talking about today?
I'm talking about a book by a lady surgeon called The Petticoat Surgeon. And it's by Bertha Van Heusen. There are actually two copies to the book. There's a modern version, an abridged version written by a Maureen Thalman of the same title. And I think they printed it up so they could have it at the museum that her home in Rochester, Michigan has been turned into. So I read that book. It's 107 pages and is sort of a synopsis of the original book, which was published in 1947. And you can find it online. I found books everywhere from $1 to $900 online, depending on the source. But it's an even better read. But I would recommend reading the synopsis first and getting a taste of what this woman's life was all about. She grew up on a farm in Rochester, Michigan, and had parents who really encouraged education. She had an older sister who was 6 years older, and they went to their father would, once they got through the primary school, would take his horse and buggy and take them into town and leave them for the week so that they could board while they went to high school. And then they were both expected to go to the University of Michigan. And this is back in the 1870s and 1880s. She her sister became a teacher. And then, there's a picture of her. Her sister became a teacher, and as Bertha was at school, her sister said, you know, teachers are a dime a dozen. There's too many teachers, and Bertha was trying to figure out what she wanted to do with her life, and she met a woman who was a physician and the daughter of a physician, and she was drawn by the way this woman dressed in a long ermine coat and a peacock feathered hat. And it kind of sort of ignited the thought that, well, shoot, I could be a doctor too. And she went home and thought about all the pros and cons of being a doctor and not being a doctor, and just sort of got the bug. And her parents said they didn't approve of that. They've been a very supportive family, but they didn't really approve of her going to medical school. But she was determined, and so she worked her way through medical school at a time when women, they were let into school, but there was a lot of prejudice against them. But there were also some very kind people too, and one of them was, I forget his first name, but Mr. Angel of Angel Hall, who was one of the first presidents of the university and a real provider for the way the university developed. And he and his wife were very kind to Bertha and encouraged her. And so she went to medical school and then saw that she wanted to get into women's issues because she felt that they needed better services than they were getting from the male doctors. And she ended up going into private practice in Chicago. And there were people who thought she was great, and she was a very bright person, but she also had a great personality. She had a very positive attitude and just kept her eye on the prize all the time and sort of ignored the men who teased or belittled or just made fun of lady doctors. They used to call them hen medics. And when she first went into a class in medical school, some of the guys would cluck like chickens at her. But, and then she just decided she was going to lie low. She kept her eye on the prize. So she went out and she bought a lot of dark material and kind of dressed like a nun, and just so that she wouldn't attract much attention in class, and just kept her eye on what she wanted to be. And all the things she got interested in turned out to be correct. She was talking about one particular surgeon who was very dramatic. He'd come out of the Civil War, and doctors in those days, when there wasn't really much in the way of anesthesia, you did best if you were quick. So you judged a doctor by how fast he could amputate that leg, or how fast he could do a surgery. So there was a lot of drama in the amphitheater when this particular surgeon would come in and demonstrate how to just thrust your hand into the belly and do what you did and get out. And a lot of his patients died, but because he was quick, Bertha thought that it probably dropped his infection rate a little lower than average. But she got very interested in Lister, who was just coming into being at that time. And Lister had these theories about washing your hands and asepsis and cutting down on infection, which was a big killer of patients. And then in her practice in Chicago, where she ended up, she did a lot of obstetrics, and she developed an anesthetic technique using morphine and a drug called scopolamine. And scopolamine is still around today. It's a good seasick pill, but it has side effects. It's an amnesic, and it's also dries up secretions, which is helpful under anesthesia. And with pregnant women who were coming in, it became known as twilight sleep, because these ladies would come in Chicago in labor, and they would get scopolamine and morphine, and they were tended very closely because it's tricky. And scopolamine is a great amnesic, and these women would come in and they'd be in labor, and then the next day they'd have their baby, and they knew nothing of what went on. All they knew is it had been a positive experience. So it became very popular. But Bertha had a great staff and a great hospital, and they really watched their patients closely. And sometimes people get a little squirrely on scopolamine. I've seen that myself. So that they essentially had some fancy straitjackets for these women, and special beds that they would just kind of contain them in while they went through labor. But because they didn't remember anything, they were fine with this. So it became a big, almost a political women's issue, and caused a lot of controversy. And some people who tried to copy the technique did it very poorly and got into trouble. And so then it sort of got a bad name, and it was not a popular technique. But Bertha was a very fine surgeon, and those who recognized that would try and get her into the upper echelons of the universities. Loyola hired her to be the head of some department, but then when they found out it was a woman who was coming in, there was a lot of pressure to not do that. So she struggled her whole life to be accepted, and yet it didn't slow her down. So she would just kind of do an end run around people, and those who were really good in their profession, the men would promote her, and she was able to present papers at international conferences, and she started the Women's Association of Medical, Women's Medical Association, whatever it is. It's still in existence. And she made a point of not only being supportive to her patients, but supportive to other women physicians all over the Midwest. And she would be a visiting professor, and they would bring in a difficult case, and she'd help them do the surgery so that that whatever accomplishments she had in her own right, she could sort of share with other women in a supportive role. And she lived to be, oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Angie.
It's so interesting to hear you talk about her struggles as a woman physician, and I was just curious if you have how your experience in medical school compared to hers.
Right. Well, 80 years later, when I went to medical school, the incidence, we were 7% women. I never found any bias against me, either from my classmates or my professors. And halfway through medical school, I accidentally got pregnant, and I got a come see me from the dean, and I thought, oh, I'm going to get a Dutch uncle talking to about, don't you know about birth control? And they merely wanted to know how much time I wanted to take off to have the baby. And they said, you can have up to 2 years off. And I thought, oh, I can't do that. So I took a month off. And then they said, what rotation would you like to be on at the time of the birth? I said, obstetrics, please. So I never found any bias anywhere. I remember once at a cocktail party, an older gentleman asked me if I intended to practice when I finished. And I said, you know, do you think I'd go to all this trouble to stay at home again? I don't think so. And he said, well, what about having children? And I said, well, I might take some time off to have children. And then I said, but I'm going to outlive you by 10 years. So I will make up for it in the end. And I did practice until I was 70. So, and I did take 5 years off when my kids were teenagers. It was, that was the hard part. You know, if I wanted to join the man's world, I had to do it on their terms. And I would hope that life is a little more friendly to the working woman now, but I would have liked to have been able to arrange the balance in my life between motherhood and medicine a little better. But I worked, you know, 80-hour weeks and had a wonderful housekeeper who's still with me, who raised my kids. But I missed a lot as a mother. I discovered I couldn't do it all, or if I did it all, I wasn't doing it as well as I wanted to. So.
Yeah, the balance is always complicated. Now, so did Bertha marry?
No, and she had, that was, you know, in the days before birth control, it was hard. You had to make a choice because you couldn't control your fertility. Although she talked a lot about contraception, she taught a lot of sex education, and she was not a prude at all. And it's interesting, when she was at Michigan, she had a Latin teacher who I think took a shine to her. He had a PhD, maybe it was in Latin. He was an Irishman, and his last name was Gailey. And he was quite enthralled with her. In fact, he asked her if he could come to her house and give her lessons in the evening. And they developed quite a relationship. And then when he tried to reach out and grasp her hands, she just kind of panicked and said, oh, you can't do that. My parents wouldn't approve. And so he kind of backed off and eventually ended up coming to Berkeley. But before he came, he wrote a couple of songs for the University of Michigan, which are played at every game, at every Glee Club concert. He wrote the Yellow and Blue, and the other one, which is a Latin name, and I can never remember it. But the Glee Club always starts every concert singing this song. And then when she wrote this memoir in her 80s, she said, you know, I'm sorry I didn't pursue that romance. So I think she regretted that, but she never really had a man in her life. She was very busy.
Right. So that's an interesting, another interesting U of M connection for sure. I know that you mentioned that she wrote her memoir in her 80s, and then there's this book. And so how did the two compare?
Oh, I loved the memoir. I went, after reading the synopsis, I was intrigued with this woman, and then I went looking for the original, and I've just started it. I'm only about 50 pages into it, so I'm learning a lot about what it was like to grow up on the farm. But she knew the names of all the plants, and she knew what was edible, like sassafras, and oh, good, thank you, Anne. And you know, that the middle of the house was the original farmhouse, but late in life, she and her sister went back and spent a lot of time living on the farm, and they expanded it and moved a lot of their family in. She learned to do all the chores on the farm. She was just curious about everything, and she's a very inclusive woman in that everything in her life connected with something else, and that's one of the things I love about brilliant people, that cross-fertilization that comes from knowing a little bit about something that's different and bringing it to something else. But there's in her writing, there's just a wonderful clarity and energy and good humor and a positive attitude, and you just feel like all things are possible when you read what this woman accomplished, because she essentially came from nothing, worked her way up, and accomplished quite a bit without being stalled by adversity. Yeah, she just, like I said, she do an end run around the men who gave her trouble and still keep going, because you can always find somebody to support you and help you and teach you. I just thought she's incredible. Wasn't an angry bone in her body. No.
Oh, that's great. So have you visited the house now that it's a museum?
No, but I'd sure love to. I haven't been to Rochester since the 1960s, when I went to see a concert at the university there, and there was a young violinist who came out and just played the most wonderful pieces, and he was crippled with polio, and it's Zach Perlman, and I'd never heard of him before, but I've been a fan of his ever since. So,
oh, wow.
I'd like to get back.
Peggy, I know that you mentioned that you're writing your own memoir. Is that part of the reason that you've been reading memoirs?
Yes. Yeah. It's to see what the style is, to see what I find interesting, and to see if I can find parallels in my own life. And with Bertha, I mean, I grew up in a funny little hotel in Western Michigan, which had all the misfits in town who stayed there. So it was quite an education, and I heard many years after I got into medical school from somebody who'd been on the admissions committee that my essay that I had written about the characters in the hotel was what had got me into medical school. So I think the foundation of our lives is laid down pretty early, and if you can build on it, that's fine. I owe a great debt of gratitude to my father, who said, "You'll never amount to a damn if you don't know how to work," and that's why he had bought the hotel, so his daughters would learn how to work. And my father had been an illegitimate child, and one of his other mantras was, "Don't you ever trust a man to look after you. You get an education, you stand on your own 2 feet. You've got a head on your shoulders. I expect you to use it." So I think Bertha had that same kind of positive can-do attitude laid down by her father, because he was very supportive of her and educated her in many ways and what he knew. And it just sort of started the whole thing, kind of lit the fuse. So
Right. Oh, this is so interesting. I love hearing about Bertha. We'll take some questions after the other presentations, and I just want to remind everybody that along your panel, you should see a Q&A button. So if you do have questions, go ahead and type them in there. So, all right, thanks, Peggy. Now, I'm happy to introduce Andrew Rutledge. Andrew worked as an intern at the Clements Library while he was finishing up his PhD at the University of Michigan, working on the Richard Port Jr. Collection of Native American photography. And he's currently working as a research associate at the Bentley Library. Andrew, what book are you sharing with us today?
Ooh, his audio. His mute button is on.
There you go. I unmuted you.
Okay.
Thank you. The book I'm here to talk about this morning is William Kunder's Lewis Cass and the Politics of Moderation. I have to admit, I'm originally from California, so I had never heard of Lewis Cass until I came to Michigan to do my PhD. And one day I was doing some research into the War of 1812 at the Clements when Cheney Choperet, the Clements' wonderful manuscripts curator, introduced me to the Cass papers. And I was just blown away by what the Clements had about this man I'd never heard of. Lewis Cass, it seemed, was involved with every major political event in American history between the War of 1812 and the Civil War. And I was just intrigued by who was this man? And my interest in that eventually led me to Kunder's wonderful biography, which, to just give a brief overview of Cass's eventful career, he started by serving as an officer during the War of 1812. He was then, in 1813, appointed the governor of Michigan, a post he held for 18 years, the third longest time of any governor in American history. Then in 1831, he left Michigan to be appointed Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War, during which time he oversaw the notorious Trail of Tears in the southern United States. And then 5 years later, he became U.S. Ambassador to France before being elected to the Senate for Michigan, a post he held for nearly 20 years. And during that time, he was also the Democratic Party's candidate for governor in 1848. Needless to say, he lost, but that's probably why I'd never heard of him, but still. And then he finally ended his career as James Buchanan's Secretary of State in the late 1850s before resigning in disgust over the succession of the southern states and Buchanan's refusal to do anything. And so I was just fascinated by how this one man was so involved with all these major events that shaped the United States in the first half of the 19th century. And three parts of his life really jumped out at me while I was reading the biography. The first was his time as governor of Michigan. As I mentioned, Cass grew up in Ohio, and he first came to Michigan as part of the U.S. Army during the War of 1812. And it sounds like he was quite the sort of dandy. The book, Kunder describes him insisting that he had the biggest, fanciest feather in his hat of anybody in the whole army when he marched to Detroit. But just a few months later, he was humiliated and embarrassed when the entire American army surrendered to the British. And Cass comes across in the biography as a very friendly, calm individual, but he never forgot that humiliation. For the next 50 years of his life, he absolutely hated the British and was convinced they were always up to no good, whether it was in Michigan, Florida, Texas, Oregon, France when he was ambassador there. He was always convinced the British were up to no good. But Cass was also a very good politician, and just a year later, in 1813, he was appointed governor for Michigan Territory, which at that point was much, much larger than the current state, as you can see from this map here that the Clements has. It included both the upper and lower peninsula, but also northern Illinois, modern Wisconsin, and most of Minnesota. And this governorship is where Cass's, I would almost say, political genius really came out, because Cass was just sort of congenitally disposed to be friendly and accommodating with everybody. He never let any sort of political dispute get in the way of a personal relationship. One of his co-workers whose papers I was also looking at describes him in the biography as saying, Cass never really had close friends. I mean, I liked him, but I didn't get along with him particularly closely, but he absolutely had no enemies, no matter what he did. He got along with everybody. And what Cass really wanted to do while he was governor was he wanted to turn Michigan and the other territories he was responsible for into states. And so he did everything in his power to encourage local self-government, setting up elected city councils, helping create Michigan's elected legislature, rather than one that was appointed, encouraging European settlement from the eastern states. He helped found the University of Michigan in 1817 and was one of the biggest donors to the original university. And when he finally left, he had succeeded amazingly. In 1813, Detroit had about 800 people living in it, and the rest of Michigan Territory had maybe 3,000 Americans. But when he left, the Lower Peninsula alone had over 35,000 American settlers living in it, and it was almost ready for statehood. Just a few years later, it would become the State of the Union. So he really did this fantastic job, expanding and creating institutions of democracy in the Northwest. But there was a real dark side as well to what he was doing, because Cass was also the United States Indian agent for the Michigan Territory. And so he was responsible for negotiating treaties with Native American peoples, which he did over 20 of during his time in Michigan. And most of these involved land sales. He was always being pushed to convince Native American peoples to sell or just give up land to the United States. One of the most famous of these was the Treaty of Saginaw in 1820, where the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples ceded basically the entirety of the lower peninsula of Michigan to the United States. And it was these negotiations that convinced Cass in this sort of patronizing and an undoubtedly racist way, to a certain extent, that Native Americans were destined to go extinct if they stayed where they were. And he was convinced that the only thing that would save them would be if they were removed from the territory of the United States, because he was looking around at these forced land sales, the destruction of their environment, the destruction of their culture and society through alcohol and various pressures. And he thought it'd be this great humanitarian gesture if they were simply removed from where they were, to someplace west of the Mississippi where they could continue to live more or less as they had. And it was this attitude, I think, which appealed to Andrew Jackson when he was elected president in the 1830s, because Jackson appointed him Secretary of War and tasked him with removing the Native American tribes of the southeastern United States, particularly the Cherokee, the Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples, from their homelands in Georgia, Florida, to Oklahoma. And this became the notorious Trail of Tears. And Cass basically bungled the whole thing. 60,000 people were forcibly ejected from their homes, and thousands died on the march. And Cass viewed this as not as a fundamental mistake, the policy. He regretted that things had not gone more smoothly and the people had died, but he remained firmly convinced that this was best for both the Native American peoples, which is why he also implemented similar policies in Michigan. Various Native American bands were forced west of the Mississippi here as well. But he was convinced this was the only way to both preserve their lives from American exceptionalism or expansionism, and also allow American expansionism to happen. And the third real element of the story that feeds directly from that American expansion was Cass's involvement with slavery. Cass personally viewed slavery as evil, but coming from his belief in sort of the sovereignty of the people, individual liberty, he held that the federal government had no right to say anything about slavery. This completely ignored the fact that he had been governor of Michigan, which Congress had said could not have slavery in it. But Cass was convinced that the people should have the right to decide. And this was this sort of blind spot in his political moderation, because he failed to understand how people in both North and South were becoming more and more angry and emotional over the issue. And slavery is what actually cost him the 1848 presidential election, because the Democratic Party split over whether or not slavery should be allowed in the new Western territories that had been taken from Mexico during the Mexican-American War. But Cass remained convinced that people should be allowed to vote, and he created the concept of popular sovereignty, that the American settlers in a new territory should vote on whether to allow slavery or not. He created this idea, even though it's most commonly associated with a different American senator, Stephen Douglas, partly because Douglas had a famous series of debates with Abraham Lincoln, whereas Cass never met the man. But popular sovereignty was a disaster. It led to massive violence, particularly in Kansas. And Cass, as the sort of father of this concept, was ridiculed in cartoons, such as this one here, where Cass is the sort of portly figure in the middle looking on as poor Liberty is being assaulted by vicious slave owners who were determined to expand this evil institution. And so by the end of the 1850s, as passions grew higher, the violence grew more and more bloody, both east and west of the Mississippi. I think Cass almost becomes this sort of tragic figure in Clunder's biography. He understands that he's now almost a politician out of time. He can't understand why people aren't willing to just compromise over this issue anymore. And so eventually, with the election of Abraham Lincoln and the succession of the southern states, he just quits. He retires from government and returns to Michigan, where he's just spends the last couple of years of his life supporting the Union in the Civil War, but just unable to understand how it had come to this. So I think Cass's life does this wonderful job of tracing both the history of the United States in the first half of the 19th century, but also showing how the politicians of the first half of that period became almost repudiated by the events of industrialization, Western expansion that they had helped create. So in that regard, I think Cass's life is just this wonderful window into understanding how America developed the way it did.
Right. Oh, it's so interesting. And thank you. And it's so good, it's always good to have someone come from an outside point of view and, remind us of historical figures that we maybe take for granted or think we know a little bit about, but not as much. So I appreciate your comments on this book. We do have a couple questions out there, but I think we'll have Emi finish her commentaries first and then answer all the questions at the end. If you do have questions, go to the Q&A section on your screen and enter them in there. So thank you, Andrew. So next, I'm introducing Emi Hastings, who is the curator of books and digital projects librarian at the Clements Library. Emi, what book are you sharing with us today?
So I've been reading Michael Vinson's Bluffing Texas Style, and it's a biography of a notorious rare book dealer from Texas named Johnny Jenkins. And he was active in the trade from 1963 to 1989. And the book opens with a mystery, which is the discovery of Jenkins' body in the Colorado River. And it turned out that he had been shot in the back of the head. So his sudden death really stunned the rare book world. He was this larger-than-life figure. He was known for high-profile acquisitions, his knowledge of Texas history. He edited the 10-volume Papers of the Texas Revolution, and he also wrote a definitive bibliographic guide to the history of Texas called Basic Texas Books. He usually wore a tall white cowboy hat, and he drove flashy cars like a Rolls-Royce and a gold Mercedes-Benz. One customer called him the P.T. Barnum of rare books, and I think this photograph from the cover of the book really illustrates that style. He also had a dark side. He was implicated in a number of forgeries of Texas historical documents and library thefts, and he had 2 suspicious fires involving his bookstore. There were also rumors that he had massive gambling debts in Las Vegas. So people wondered whether his death was perhaps a mob hit, connected to the forgeries that he had been selling, or was it a carefully staged suicide? So the book really delves into Jenkins' life story from childhood onwards to try to figure out the source of all of these shenanigans. His love of Texas history and rare books started very early, but so did his shady dealings. While he was attending the University of Texas in the early 1960s, he worked at the state archives, and some evidence suggests that that was when he began stealing letters and documents to sell. Paradoxically, he also worked to foil other book thieves. Beginning early in his career, he was involved in an FBI sting to catch some book thieves who had offered him stolen materials. And later, as president of the Antiquarian Booksellers Association of America, he wrote a pamphlet on how to report rare book thefts and instituted a theft reporting system with the FBI. He took big business risks, and he often went for publicity stunts rather than sort of long-term strategic business choices. And he would do very unethical things like offer a highly valuable book for sale, but then substitute an inferior copy with missing pages or a forgery after the customer had paid for the item. And then when he was in financial trouble in 1985, his warehouse of books burned down. Although conveniently, the most valuable books in the collection had already been stored elsewhere. He was able to collect $2 million in insurance money from this fire. But then, in even more dire straits with gambling debts, about 2 years later, his new office building also caught fire. And this time, the fire marshal suspected arson. He had been seen driving away from the building as the fire trucks were going towards it, and it became pretty clear that the fire had been started deliberately in the mailroom with some kind of accelerant. And at the same time that this arson investigation was starting to take off, other book dealers like Thomas Taylor were beginning to notice this pattern of forged Texas documents that were coming on the market. And it seemed like all of them could be traced back in some way to Jenkins and to another man named Dorman David. Several of these fakes were discovered in the inventory that Jenkins was trying to claim as fire damage for insurance purposes in the second fire. Now, Jenkins claimed to have been duped by the forgeries just like everyone else. He blamed it all on the other man, Dorman David. But customers began demanding refunds for things that they had bought from him that turned out to be misdescribed or forgeries. And his biggest customer, who had been buying highly valuable books from him for years, brought in another dealer to examine his collection of Texas books from Jenkins. And they found that nearly 60% of the collection had been misdescribed, was missing pages or maps or things like that. And a total of 4 forgeries had been passed off to him. And so this customer demanded refunds for all of that misdescribed material. So with the forgeries, the arson investigation closing in, his business debts racking up, Jenkins was really getting backed into a corner. But his deepest secret at this time was that he was not actually the highly successful champion poker player that he had portrayed himself as. He had racked up almost $1 million in secret gambling debts in Las Vegas casinos. And these were later paid off after his death with a secret life insurance policy that he had left for that purpose. It was a point of honor for him to have his gambling debts paid. So when he died in 1989, all of these things were raising questions about the circumstances of his death. He had been shot in the back of the head and his body was found in the river, but he was apparently in a position that could have been consistent with a self-inflicted wound, and it appeared that he'd actually been standing in the river when shot. He hadn't been pushed in afterwards. The gun which killed him was never found, although investigators did drag the river for it, and there was no sign of a struggle or a second person near the riverbank where his body was found. It was just his car parked there and then his own presence. And he had previously talked to people about how to stage a suicide to look like a murder for the insurance money. So given all of these circumstances, his death was ultimately ruled a suicide, even though there were still these lingering questions and they never did find the weapon. I think the book does make a convincing case for suicide, given Jenkins' personality and his desire to assert control over a situation that was really spiraling out of his control. The author spends a lot of time examining Jenkins' motives, why he was driven to forge and steal and lie to people, even when he could have made an honest living. He had, so far as we know, a pretty happy childhood. He had many professional successes. He was elected president of the ABAA, and he could be a very charismatic and persuasive bookseller. But he always seemed to end up kind of spoiling it by trying to cheat people, even when it would have been in his best interest to maintain a good relationship with a trusted, loyal customer. So this doesn't seem to be a case where a previously honest man is sort of driven to crime by desperation later in life. It seems pretty clear that this was a pattern of behavior that he established very early on. And the book really effectively uses the poker playing to frame that story and to bring in insights about the art of playing cards, the bluff, the psychology of compulsive gambling, to explain why Jenkins was driven to take these risks, even when it was against his own interests. And the book draws upon really extensive archival research in Jenkins' papers at Southern Methodist University, and also interviews with a number of people who knew him. The papers were donated in 2015 and 2017, so previous writings about him did not have access to that material. So I think there's a lot of really great material that's revealed for the first time in this book. It's a very highly readable and engaging story. I think, you know, if you end up reading it, I think you'll probably find yourself wanting to read more. So my last slide has a few recommendations to share for further reading. I think a great introduction to Jenkins' story is actually a New Yorker article by Calvin Trillin that was published in 1989 after his death. It's a very accessible sort of introduction. You might even want to read this article before you read the book. It's available online to New Yorker subscribers, or you can read a reprint of it in the latest Clements Library publication, Americana is a Creed. I also recommend for more details about the forgeries and the thefts from libraries that he was implicated in, the dealer Thomas Taylor, who worked to uncover these things, has published his own book in 1991, which is really delving into the documents, how they were made, how they were uncovered. It's a very interesting detective story in its own right. If you're intrigued about the subject of library thefts in general, I would recommend Michael Blanding's The Map Thief. He came and spoke at the Clements Library in 2014. It was a very interesting talk. And also for an introduction to the world of rare book dealing and collecting and many of the interesting characters involved, I recommend Nicholas Basbane's A Gentle Madness. It's a great introduction to the field.
Thank you, Emi. I'm just astounded by how many, you know, complicated, charismatic, intriguing characters there are in the book world.
Very true.
So that was great. We do have some questions, and everybody can continue to put them in the Q&A. I'm just going to do some housekeeping final announcements, and then we'll answer questions until 11 o'clock or so. Thanks, Emi. So next week, we have a panel once again, and it's going to be a lot of fun. They'll be talking about American histories and the struggle for equality. And here are some of the books we will be discussing with Rex Hauser and Haley O'Malley. So join us again next week for that. As you know, we started this Bookworm as a way to connect during the stay-at-home orders, and your participation and enthusiasm for the Bookworm has quite frankly overwhelmed us. It's really wonderful. Many thanks to everyone who participated in our polls the last couple of weeks to give us some feedback about the future of the Bookworm. We're currently planning episodes through June on a weekly basis, and the poll did show that there's significant interest for continuing beyond that. So we will, we're in the process of deciding how frequently we're able to continue the Bookworm and exploring those kinds of options right now. We also saw that you're interested in some merchandise, so we're working on some ideas for that as well to announce soon. I know that many of you already support the Clements Library, and I thank you for that financial support and your vote of confidence in our mission. If you would like to make a gift to the Clements, you'll find a link to do so in the chat box, and you'll also find a link when we send out the follow-up email later today. Once you're signed up for the Bookworm, if you're new this week, you do not have to sign up again. And if you missed an episode, we send out an email to everyone who signed up with the recording as well as links to the resources discussed today. So you'll receive that later today. So thank you so much. All right, let's do some Q&A. Okay, some questions here. So the first question is for Peggy, and asking if Van Heusen used midwifery as part of her knowledge and practice.
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what the question was. Van Heusen certainly delivered a lot of babies. I don't think she really believed in home deliveries if you had access to a hospital, because, and I've given a lot of obstetrical anesthesia. Home deliveries are great. The consequences of everything going well are on your side, but I mean, but the consequences of when they don't go well are disastrous. And so would not be a fan of home deliveries unless there was no other choice. I think the hospital could be made a little more friendly. And a lot of hospitals have worked to provide a homier environment for a delivery. But she did a lot of difficult deliveries. She did some forceps deliveries. And in one incident, she had a patient who had lost several babies because they couldn't be delivered. So when she got pregnant for the 6th time, Van Heusen did a C-section, which was still a very dangerous operation in those days. She had a big audience, a big amphitheater filled with several hundred people, I think, and it went very well, very successfully. She was an incredibly fine surgeon. Developed some techniques, did very difficult cases, and rarely had a problem. She was exceptional.
Wow, wow. That's great. Thank you so much. I see a couple of questions here relating to Lewis Cass, and wondering about why he was known as Big Belly to the Native Americans.
Well, if you look at that cartoon, you can sort of see where that nickname might have come from. Especially as he grew older, Cass definitely became a little more portly, and his political enemies in the 1850s actually took to calling him Senator Gas because of both his size and he had a tendency to drone on during senatorial speeches. So I think that's probably where that nickname originated. But he seems to have generally had, at least while he was governor of Michigan, reasonable relationships with Native American peoples during the negotiations, despite what he was objectively trying to do. They seem to have understood he was generally an honest negotiator compared to various other officials and Indian agents they had to deal with.
So a related question then is, many of the Native Americans in Michigan survived by retreating to Upper Michigan and the UP. Was Cass involved?
He was certainly involved with some of that, but the majority of those removals and retreats happened after he had left Michigan for Washington, D.C. He was responsible for overseeing the forcible removal of certain peoples in southern Michigan to west Mississippi, and that led to all sorts of both tragedies and dramas. But the majority of Native Americans were already sort of retreating north and west from the time he became governor, simply because of the flood of American immigrants. He certainly did not try and stop American immigration, white American settlers into Michigan, but he did not forcibly remove Native Americans, at least according to Clunder's book, while he was governor.
Okay. Someone's asking, was Henry Clay's life parallel in ways to that of Cass?
I'm going to confess I don't know that much about Henry Clay. I don't. Clay seems to have been much more, from my knowledge of him, from what I have read, much more strident in his political views, and despite his famous a great compromiser, he was not a personal compromiser on the level of Cass was, but he was also in the thick of Washington politics for a much longer period than Cass was, since Cass was in Michigan until the 1830s and Clay was in Congress since the 1810s. So I could say maybe. That's
Well, that's fair. That's fair. There's a question if there's any discussion in the book about Lewis Cass's opinion of Zechariah Chandler.
There is only a couple paragraphs because Cass was sort of horrified by the rise of the Republican Party, which Chandler, who became one of the first Michigan senators from the Republican Party, was a leading figure in, because he viewed it as a sectional group designed to inflame passions over the issue of slavery rather than create compromise over an issue that he thought the federal government should have nothing to do with. So he didn't particularly like Chandler on a political level, but as with all of his political dealings, he seems to have been on reasonably friendly terms with him personally.
Okay. I'm going to skip down to a question for Emi. And Paul is asking, does the book reveal any new details about Jenkins' pursuit and ultimate purchase of the Eberstadt collection? When he was, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, yes, that is one of the chapters, is in-depth discussion of the Eberstadt purchase and why it was both in some ways a good business choice, but also in many ways not handled well. Ultimately, it ended up costing him a lot of money.
All right, great. Thank you. So back to Andrew. How did Cass, as Secretary of War, help Michigan's statehood in opposition to Ohio's, e.g. the Toledo War?
Well, Cass was absolutely convinced that Michigan deserved Toledo, but by the time that Toledo War really took off in 1835, he was very much sort of on the outs with the Jackson administration, despite still being Secretary of War, and his political opinions were not sought in any meaningful way by anyone at that point. And then he resigned and was appointed ambassador to France before the Great Compromise that gave Michigan the UP was settled. Though I think he, unlike a lot of people in Michigan, he seemed to accept the UP because he had explored a great deal of it during his early time as governor and understood the mineral and wealth that it held. So I don't think he was thrilled with the compromise, but he accepted it, but he did not have any real ability to shape it.
Okay, interesting. So we have a couple of, they're questions, but also much bigger questions about whether or not Cass deserves all the recognition that he has in the state, and or should he be recognized more outside of the state as well, but also, one of those situations of his racism and Indian removal policies and other things. It does create an interesting dilemma. I doubt very much that we can solve that dilemma here. I don't know if anyone has any comments on that or has read anything further about it or noticed any news.
That's such a huge question.
It is. It's huge. It's huge. but I appreciate people bringing it up. I mean, I think those are the kinds of, questions that history helps us to examine and helps us to think more about, so that we know more about how the country was shaped. So,
yeah. I'll say this: Clunder's book does not really address that sort of aspect of Cass's legacy, looking back on him today. The book itself is much more sort of focused on his life and sort of immediate legacy in the 19th century. So Clunder's book in that regard does not help discuss this question at all. Though I would say in general, I'm always a firm believer in having historical figures known more across the country, no matter where they're from. So in that regard, I think Cass's name should be at least semi-recognizable.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Emi, we have a question for you. Does the book mention fellow book dealer Larry McMurtry and what his experiences, views were of Jenkins?
I don't remember his name coming up in the book. There are several other book dealers who are interviewed with regards to their relationship with Jenkins, but I don't think Larry McMurtry is mentioned that I recall.
Okay, thank you. Do any of you have questions for each other before we sign off?
I have one question for Emi, if she doesn't mind. It's actually a question about a question you answered. What was the Eberwhite purchase? I have to know.
Oh, yes. So Eberstadt was
Eberstadt.
who was another famous American book dealer. And so I think, I don't remember the exact circumstances, but the firm was closing and they were selling off their inventory. And Jenkins made the very bold choice to purchase the entire remaining inventory. I think he brought in at least one other business partner to help him with this. And then that became a huge part of his own business to sell off these books. So it was a very risky thing for him to do. It had a lot of fabulous material in the collection, but I don't know if he was fully ready to take it all on at that time.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, great. This has been really fascinating. I've enjoyed hearing about all three of these books. Thank you so much for sharing today. And everyone who participated as an audience member, thank you so much. We appreciate you as well. Everybody have a great weekend, and we hope you sign in again next week. Bye, everybody.
Bye.